Howdy ho, everybody. Your favorite history teacher back here with some more World War II notes for you. Up to this point, and we've been hitting World War II for several weeks now, I've talked a lot about like the build up to the war, and we've gotten into specific battles and how the two different fronts or theaters of the war are playing out. Today, we're shifting gears a little bit, and I want to look at the home front. So, when I talk about the home front, of course, this is an American history class. I'm not really looking at what was going on in the British or the German or Japanese home front. We're talking about the American home front. So for this one, you could add this on to notes that you already have going, but it might be an ideal time to just start off a fresh, clean page. And we for sure will have some assignments that tie into this, and there's going to be a handful of exam questions. I'm actually throwing quite a few exam questions will come right off of this little lecture that we're doing today. Saw some different images for you, some propaganda up there. See a bunch of women on a construction site, which would have not been typical at all back in that day. But women and other minority groups really step it up as lots of men get drafted and sent over to fight the war. So that'll be kind of one of the big themes. Now, of course, one of the big things after Pearl Harbor, we need to beef up our army. Today, we think of America as having a really big standing army. We do. We spend more money than anybody else in the world by a lot for our like defense budget. And America has a lot of soldiers, but that wasn't always the case. You go back to like pre-World War I, America had a pretty big navy, but we actually always had a really, really small, pretty tiny army. Going into World War I think we had like the 40 largest army in the world. In between now World War I, we really beef up our army, but then in the time period between World War I and World War II, we kind of go back to isolationism and our military shrinks down. We keep a big navy, but our ground army gets quite small again. Now, when World War II hits, Pearl Harbor gets attacked, and then 2 days later, Germany declares war on us. Well, we need a bunch of soldiers again. So we reenact the Selective Service Act. That's a fancy way of saying, or what it's more commonly called, is the draft. So you definitely want to have that. There will be an exam question, possibly some quiz questions coming up, and know that the Selective Service Act, you should have that as a heading, which is AKA, also known as the draft. And I would want you to have this stat. Overall, about 16 million, a little more than 16 million Americans wore a uniform of some kind in World War II, and many of them fought and saw combat, but others were just in the military and support roles too. Of that 16 plus million number, about 10 million were drafted. But there's also, of course, many volunteers too. And like after Pearl Harbor, there's kind of this like rally around the flag effect. We've seen it in more recent times, like right after the 9/11 attacks. That happened when I was in college. And I remember, like, in the weeks and months following, Americans were outraged that we got attacked. People were fired up about it, and there was a wave of young men that went and enlisted in the military. Now, we haven't had a draft, an active draft, since the Vietnam War, and we'll get into that more in quarter 4. But at this time, the Selective Service Act between World War I and World War II was like not activated. So our military was voluntary basis only, like it is today. But then, of course, when World War II hits, we need a lot of guys in uniform. We're going to have to be fighting this epically big war. So the draft goes into effect again. And how it works, you have like you basically all young men in the draft age be like 18 to, and I'm not sure what the top end age is, but we don't want to have guys that are like 60 years old. You're looking for men in like prime fighting age, basically from 18 to figure roughly around 30 or so. Those are the guys that we would think would make the best soldiers and are able-bodied and healthy. Those guys would all get a draft like registration certificate. And essentially, think of it almost like the lotto, except in this case, you're not winning money, and they'll actually just generate and pull up the numbers will come up. And if that's the number you have on your draft card, well, you're going to get a notification, and it's like you have X amount of days. You got a month to get your affairs in order, and then you need to go report to the draft board, and you're going to be off to basic training, and they'll tell you whether you're going in the Navy or the Army or Marine Corps or whatever the case may be. We hopefully you remember from the propaganda unit in World War I. There's Uncle Sam down there. I want you for the U.S. Army. That was first used in World War I, and of course that gets recycled and used again in World War II, because that's a really iconic and cool image of Uncle Sam, and is used to like recruit guys in and get them ready to go off and fight and hopefully win this war. Next up, segregation in the military. I probably haven't spent enough time on this in the unit, in our World War II unit yet. We had talked about it a little bit in World War I. And if you remember back to that unit, the Army and America in general, like racism was just a whole different animal 100-ish years ago than it is today. America was pretty rigidly segregated in most places around the country, especially down in the South. Well, the military was also segregated too. And in World War I, if you were a black soldier in the American Army, you wouldn't see combat. They were only used for like support roles. The policy changes a little bit by World War II. So in World War II, black soldiers are allowed to see combat, but they're also still segregated, kept into kind of like isolated units. So think of it like in the American Army in World War II, you would have basically white soldiers that make up the bulk of the fighting force. But also, if you happen to be like American Indian or Latino, Asian American, they would all get kind of lumped together and thrown together in the general army. And then there were specifically separate units that were just all black soldiers. They are used for combat in World War II. They do get to go out and prove themselves in battle and see combat, but they're not allowed to mix with like the white soldiers. So seems kind of ridiculous and stupid, especially by today's standards. But remember, the country, the context of the times we're talking about, it was just the country was a different place, especially in terms of race back in this era. If you don't know what segregation is, that's a good term for this class, and we're going to use it a lot more when we come up into quarter 4 and hit the civil rights unit. So that's a good word, not only for you to know for American history class, but you just want to have that word in your vocabulary as you go through life. You still will hear it get used today. So segregation and how we would use it in this class, how it would pertain to American history, it essentially, to sum it up, it's separation based on race. And typically segregation, the way we're going to talk about it and use it and learn about it, it's affecting the black community most. And so the opposite of segregation would be integration. Another good word for you. And integration is like the combining together of the different races. So today, and really after World War II, the U.S. Army gets integrated. This is the last war that we are going to have a segregated army in. And then afterwards, by the time we get into the next war, a few years after World War II, which is the Korean War, we'll get into that a little bit down the road. The Army is going to be integrated by then. All right. Next up, public support for the war. This is, I think we kind of have a disconnect for this today, because the wars that have gone on in our lifetime and that are still kind of sort of ongoing, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're nothing like World War II. World War II was just such a massive conflict. It impacted everybody's life, whether you were fighting in the war or not. Whereas the wars that have happened in my lifetime, like right after the 9/11 attacks when we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, I can honestly say, like, I had strong feelings about it. I knew people that served, but it really didn't affect my life as I was going to college at Central Michigan, or I got out and was going into the teaching field and started working here. It didn't really impact me. Well, that wasn't the case for World War I and World War II. Those conflicts are on a much larger scale, and it impacts everybody, whether you're fighting in it or not. The home front was definitely affected here in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and then I'm going to come back to these ones. I really like the war bonds, victory gardens, propaganda. We had covered all that stuff in the World War I unit. I essentially think that like that stuff gets recycled and used over again, and it's really kind of comparable in both world wars. But how people's lives were affected on the home front was primarily through rationing. What is rationing? That's like conserving important materials that are going to be needed for the war effort. So things that would have been rationed during the war, like fuel, you could only buy so much gasoline. Doesn't matter how much money you have. Different families are only allotted so much fuel, and it was really hard to come by because most of the fuel, the gasoline and diesel, that's going to be used out in our aircraft carriers and in our planes and tanks and stuff like that. It's being used for the war effort. Even food was rationed. Like you could only go to the grocery store, no matter how much money you had to buy it, which you still had to spend money on it. You would get ration tickets, and you were only allowed to go buy so much meat and eggs and certain staples like that that. And you would get more ration tickets depending on how many people were in your family, how many mouths there were to feed. Because a lot of our food from the big American farms is going to be sent over and used for the Allied armies. We have to feed our soldiers out in the field too. Another thing that's rationed that you might not necessarily think of, but metal. Anything that's made of metal, metal is a crucial war material, and steel. We have to make bullets and tanks and planes and all that stuff. So even things like nails, those were being rationed. Like if you had a construction project going on in 1941 or on into early 1942, it probably just got put on hold and you didn't get to finish it until after the war. Personal story from the Taluki family. I had already told you my Grandpa Stan. Grandpa Taluki, he's my dad's dad. He fought with Patton in Northern Europe, kind of through France and Germany in the last year of the war. Well, he had got married to my grandma in 1940, and they had a little daughter who was my Aunt Mary. He had started building a house. It's over kind of by Ives Garden, if you know where the corn market is, where you go get sweet corn around here. Anyway, he had the basement of the home dug out. He had the foundation kind of laid and the top or the base level floor. And then Pearl Harbor happened and he gets drafted and he's off to boot camp and going to be going over to fight in Europe. Well, the house wasn't all done, but they were living there already, in the basement. It was kind of livable, but they were essentially just kind of living in the basement of the house. And he was the one that was building it, him and his brothers. Well, he gets sent off to boot camp, so your labor's gone. But my grandma actually had family friends and stuff that would have come and continued to work on the house for her, but she couldn't finish the project because they couldn't buy nails. You couldn't actually get nails to go nail the boards together and finish the construction on it because all the metal is being used for war materials. So essentially my grandma and Aunt Mary, who was a little baby at the time, they just lived in the basement of my grandpa's house for about 3 years until the war finally finished and things stopped being rationed and grandpa came back and finished the house. So women and minorities, they're affected in a big way in the war too, where they're often really kind of discriminated against and marginalized and pushed to the bottom. And most of the best jobs back in this era would have gone to white men because it was seen as the white man or really the man in general was seen as the primary breadwinner in any family. And then because of the racial aspects of what the country was like back then, the better jobs typically went to white guys. And a lot of times black guys were discriminated against and especially through the years of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the unemployment rate was through the roof for everybody, but it was even higher in the black community. Well, the war is going to change everything there because now you have 10 million plus guys getting drafted up. The bulk of that number was white men that had worked in factories and on farms, and now they're going over to fight in Europe. Well, we still need our factories producing. Actually, we need them producing more than ever now to make the weapons of war. We're going to be, our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, America is the arsenal of democracy. He gave a famous speech on that, and what he means is America has the best factories. That's one thing we do really good at. So we're actually not only producing weapons for just the American army, we're producing a lot of the weapons that the British are going to use, and we give a lot of materials to the Russians and our Chinese allies that are that are fighting against the other Axis powers too. So to keep the factories rolling and our farms rolling, women and minority groups really step it up. Which in a way, you might think we're taking advantage of them, but I think there's a silver lining to that too, and a lot of pros, because that breaks down some of the barriers that were just the old school thinking that women can't handle shop work, or maybe, black guys aren't smart enough to do this kind of labor. Well, now we need them, and they get put into these roles, and they do get high paying jobs. They're making good money in these factories, so it opens doors for them. And then after the war, it makes it much, much harder to say, well, you women, your place is in the house, or black guys, you couldn't handle a high-end technical factory job like this, because they've been doing this stuff all through the war years, so they can do it. You know what I mean? It's kind of like proof that they're capable of that kind of work. So I think the war in that way kind of restructures and shifts a lot of attitudes in society. And in moving past World War II, that's going to change a lot of people's views and attitudes on race and gender. And that'll kind of segue in and eventually lead into the next unit we're hitting in class. For war bonds, victory gardens, propaganda, that stuff, like I said, is all a lot of repeat from World War One. We're still using propaganda posters. Like, for example, this one was not used in World War One. My cursor's on right now, but we can do it. Her name is Rosie the Riveter, kind of a made-up character. And what could you get? What do you think that propaganda poster is about? Obviously it's saying that like us women, we're tough too, and we can go in. And Rosie the Riveter was a riveter putting rivets in on bomber planes in factories, and saying that women are capable of doing the factory tough jobs too. So anyway, propaganda gets used over, and then war bonds. If you don't know what those are, you can still buy like U.S. government savings bonds, but back in this era, they were often called war bonds or liberty bonds. What that was, the government had already raised taxes to pay for this hugely expensive war. But even just raising taxes, that wasn't enough to pay for the whole war effort. So the government essentially needs to start taking out loans. And they tried to convince as many people as possible to go out and buy war bonds. And you could look at this as like a win-win situation, because say you went and bought $100 war bond, it would cost you half that amount, $50. So you're giving the US government $50 of your money, all right? And they're using it as a loan to go spend on war materials. Well, you hold on to that bond and you spent $50 on it and you can't redeem it for like 10 years, say. It would be a certain amount of time. But when you do go redeem it after that, the loan is done at 10 years, you're going to get $100 back. So it's like the government gets its money when it needs it right now for this war effort that's very pressing, and you're going to get some profit in the long term. You'll get your money back plus interest. All right, next up, America's industrial capacity. It's a fancy way of saying America's factories. If there's one thing America does right and that we have an advantage on every other country for, it's our industrial capacity, our factories. We do that right. America has a greater industrial capacity. We have more factories and better factories than any other country on earth back in this era. If you remember the intro to the war in the Pacific, when I was talking about Japan, our industrial capacity was 20 times what Japan's was. So think of it like for every one plane Japan can make, we could make 20 planes. For every one aircraft carrier they can produce, we'll produce 20 of them. And actually, as the war goes on, that increases in our favor. By the end of the war, after we've been bombing out Japanese factories, then our industrial capacity was probably 100 times what Japan's was. Hitler, after or right up leading up to the Pearl Harbor attack, he was considering whether to declare war on America or not. And some of his advisors actually warned him and said, hey, America has a lot of factories. You know, that Henry Ford guy that you kind of like, and we both are on the same page with the Jews. Remember, Henry Ford was one American that actually Hitler respected in kind of a weird way. Hitler, when he heard the numbers of how much stuff America could produce, he laughed at it. He thought the numbers were overblown and exaggerated. Well, actually, he was wrong. He was an idiot to laugh at that, because the specs that the Germans had brought in and presented to him about how much stuff America could make, they were incorrect. But America could produce more stuff than their estimates were. Now, if he had known that, that might have changed his mind on declaring war on America. But Hitler often just did things, I think, as a gut reaction, and he didn't think it through deeply enough. So anyway, it's probably best in the whole grand scheme of things that it did play out that way, because America does join in the war, and ultimately the Nazis, that are a evil force, get defeated, and America is a big part of that victory. Now, what country has the second most factories? Actually, at this time, it's the Soviet Union. So Russia has a lot of factories too, not quite as much as America, and our factories are probably a little better. But think about it. The two countries that can produce the most stuff are both allied powers. So that right there says a lot. And ultimately, it would be very, very hard. It's going to be a long shot for the Axis powers to ever end up winning that war once America and the Soviet Union are on full mobilization of the war in full production mode. So what gets made here in Michigan? because we have factories all over the country, but to focus on our state, because Michigan is a big factory state, especially back at this time. It's the home of the auto industry. You have Ford Motor Company and General Motors that were producing cars leading up to the war. Well, through the war years, there are no new cars really made. They're making some trucks and Jeeps for the war effort, but all those factories stopped producing cars. No more Model Ts or anything like that. Now they retool and kind of tweak those factories, and they in Michigan start making a lot of planes. That's what we were known for. We produce B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-51 Mustangs. This photo at the top, that's a photo of a B-17 bomber, and I'm going to cover the Allied air war in one of our next lectures coming up soon. This was at the Willow Run Bomber Plant. If you've ever gone out on I-94 heading towards Detroit, you'll see where the Willow Run Airport is. They actually have a museum out there today, and that was a big bomber plant where, girls like Rosie the Riveter are in there working on these factories 24/7, trying to produce as many planes as we can, because that'll let us take the war to the Axis powers quickest. Before we can even land a ground army in Europe and start battling the Nazis, as soon as we get planes over there, we can automatically start bombing German factories and German cities. So that helps us, start throwing punches much earlier by using this new aviation technology. And really, Michigan is kind of the heart of where these planes are going to be manufactured. Next up. So last slide I have for you. When we get into the war in it's really the end of the year in 1941, but we start mobilizing beginning of the year in 1942. That officially marks the end of the Great Depression. So remember the Great Depression, and you think back to like the movie Cinderella Man and how like Jim Braddock and his family were struggling and unemployment was super high. Well, things had gotten better. You know what I mean? Like during 1932, 33, 34, those were the worst years of the Depression, kind of when Cinderella Man was set. Things had gotten better by the late 1930s, but we were still in a depression. People were still really hurting, and unemployment was still way too high. Well, the war snaps us out of that real quick, because now the government places massive loans for all of these war products. That gets all of our factories ripping and roaring, and we are producing tons of stuff. So now their unemployment essentially drops down to zero. Everybody has a job. We have a place for everybody to go work. And of course, another big factor in that is millions of American men that were in those factory jobs are now off fighting in the war. So that frees up a lot of jobs too. And it really jumpstarts the economy. Typically, when a country gets into a war, usually, at least initially, that's a boost to the economy. Now, the downside to that is, here's an important term for you, kind of an economic term that Mr. Haynes will probably explain more next year. I'm guessing you're already kind of familiar with this, whether you know it or not. This is when the American government starts deficit spending. Now, what is deficit spending? Have you ever heard of the national debt? Like today, after the whole coronavirus like pandemic, and the government has been sending out checks and printing more money. Today, our national deficit is something like 26 trillion with a T, dollars. Well, you go back to World War I, America had no national debt. Actually, other countries owed us money because we had given huge loans out to the British and French and other countries. So America was a crediting nation back in the World War I to World War II era. Well, by the time we get into World War II, now this is going to be different than World War I. We're in it more long term because we were only in World War I in the last year or so. We're in World War II for three-ish years. And we got to produce stuff through that whole amount of time. Well, the government doesn't have enough money to basically place all these orders in factories and pay all the factory workers for this work that they're doing. So the government starts to take out loans. Deficit spending is we spend more money than we're taking in. And really, you can see this little graph I put here. We started a little bit of deficit spending during the Great Depression, trying to get the economy jump-started, but it wasn't a tremendous amount. Here it is. Here's that massive spike in World War II, where the government starts taking out huge loans. And then it dips back down for a while, but really, From World War II on to today, the government has consistently been in deficit spending for like 80 years now, where we every year we spend a little bit more money than we take in, or sometimes a lot more money than we take in that national debt. Really like started to accumulate in World War II, but it was fairly small. And then over the next 80 years on through to today, that national deficit has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's kind of becoming a big problem because at some point we're going to have to pay that money back, or we're going to end up going into default. And how's that going to affect the economy? Your guess is probably as good as mine, but I'm guessing it won't be good. And you know who's going to be paying for it? You guys. You're going to be the taxpayers of the next generation. So that's a problem you might want to have on your radar. And hopefully, we get some smart people figuring out some solutions to it. All right, that's what I have for you on the war on the home front today. Hope you enjoyed it. It all made sense. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and I'll give you some clarification. Have a good evening.